It's great to meet you. I'm looking forward to getting into the book and your career and your work. So thank you for taking a minute out today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So before we get into the book, before we get into your life, I want to begin with this. 6 years ago, this pandemic changed so much about our world and what we're doing. How did you get through that era, and how has it influenced the way that you work and live today?
Well, it was a terrible time. And of course, there were many people who got horribly sick and lost their lives even. But for me personally, it was actually not difficult at all. I had recently retired from my longtime day job, and I was sort of beginning a new phase of life as a full-time writer. So, for me, it ended up being very productive. I mean, I masked up and went to the supermarket. I hiked in the hills with my dog and I wrote. And that was basically what it was like for me. And so it actually worked out very well. I wrote most of this novel during the pandemic.
Well, and that's what I was thinking too, how this coincided with it. So before we get into the novel, I want to begin with this. 13, if I put you in front of a bunch of 13-year-olds at career day, and one of the kids wanted to know what you do for a living, how do you explain your work and your career to a bunch of 13-year-olds?
I would say I write stories, some of them short, some of them longer, and I write stories for people to read. I'm a storyteller.
So, what did you want to be at that age? Did you always want to be a writer, like when you were a kid?
Well, when I was very young, I went through the usual list. I wanted to be a firefighter. Later on, I think I wanted to be a doctor. And then I always liked making things. So at one point, I decided I wanted to be an engineer because I used to tinker with things. When I got a little older, I was actually a ham radio operator. And went off to college to study engineering and then ended up, changing into the humanities. But I always liked making things. And in some ways, I feel like that's still what I do. I make stories. And I can remember certain experiences I had when I was very young where my maker instinct came out. My grandfather was a tailor. And I have vivid memories of going into his shop, going into the back there where he had his shop, and finding scraps of material on the floor and sewing them together. I mean, I was 5 years old and I'd learned how to thread a needle and sew things. So I made little weird things out of scraps of material. And then I can also remember being with my grandmother. They had a dairy farm, and they'd bring, this is in the early 50s, they'd bring in, a pail of milk from the barn, and she'd churn her own butter and then use that to make cookies. And so even at that age, I just loved the idea of making things. And in some ways, I feel like that's what I do now. I make stories out of words.
So, where are you originally from?
I grew up in a small town in Kentucky called Maysville.
Okay. So, who were some writers, authors, inspirational forces that were a part of you becoming a storyteller?
Well, one of again, I think they were not so much famous people, but my paternal grandmother, the one who lived on the farm, I have these vivid memories of sitting with her on her front porch. It's a very Southern thing to sit on the porch, and she'd tell stories of, when she was a little girl, many of which were fascinating. I mean, one story I still remember is when she was a little girl, the Ku Klux Klan came up to their house and they were going to beat up her father because he'd been talking bad things about the Klan. And her mother came out on the porch carrying a Bible in one hand and an American flag in the other and told them all they were being bad people and to get off of the property. And so they hung their heads and left. And so, that I mean, I just loved hearing her stories. And I think probably at some level that made me want to eventually tell them for myself.
So what was the beginning? What was like the first story that you wrote that you got a visceral experience or got a visceral response that made you think, I got this. This is something I can do.
Well, when I was in the fourth grade, I wrote a short story. I had fallen in love for the first time. And the girl, unfortunately for me, was a senior high school cheerleader. So she was 17 and I was 9. This was not going to work.
No.
So, but I wrote a story in which we went to the moon together. And I can remember reading the story aloud in class. And of course, the students were howling with laughter and, yelling. But I got a response and I was able to tell the story. And so that's one of my early memories. The other thing, a little more serious that I remember is when I was a junior in high school, that day that everyone in my generation remembers so well, November 22nd, 1963, the principal came on the loudspeaker and said that the president had been shot. And one of the guys in my class said, I hope he dies. And so I was moved to write a school editorial slash think piece about that. And I remember that being, I mean, I felt that that was important. And in some ways, I feel like that's the moment I became a writer.
So my dad joined the Air Force. He lived in New York. He was born in Brooklyn, raised in Long Island, joined the Air Force, and that's why we're in Kansas City. But I remember his story. It was one of the most memorable stories he ever told me about that day. He was on a trash truck, and there was a guy with him. He was a big black man, and he was a jovial but a quiet guy. And all of a sudden that day, he was over on the curb crying. He was like, "This is the last guy in the world that you would ever see crying." And he went over, he said, "What the hell's the matter with you?" And he just looked up and said, "The only chance that we had is gone."
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I'll never forget that story from that day. I mean, there were so many stories and so many ways that the news came out, but just that there were so many people that were dependent on him giving them that chance, that level of civil rights and equality, and to see it that way, it was wild. So let me ask you this: if is before we get into San Quentin Exodus, talk to me a little bit about your evolution as a writer leading up to this book.
So, when I went to college, I became a student journalist. I wrote for the campus newspaper. This was Purdue University. And I worked my way up and finally became editor in chief of the campus newspaper. And this was the 60s, civil rights, war in Vietnam, all of these issues sort of came together. And the paper, even though Purdue was quite a conservative campus, the paper became a kind of liberal voice addressing the issues of the day. And this upset the university administration quite a lot. They thought that the campus newspaper should be really a kind of public relations organ for the university. And so the president fired me as editor of the paper, simply announced it. And the campus rose up in protest, students and professors alike. He had to back down. And so in some ways, that was one of the most important experiences of my life was, being a part of freedom of the press, fighting for it. In that case, we actually won, and believing that, that writing is important. Also in my senior year, I took a course in creative writing. And so I, realized you could do more than just tell what happened, which is sort of the job of a journalist. You could make stories up. And so I got interested in writing short stories. Um, Began to develop that as I could over the years. I mean, I was always a full-time teacher, so my writing time was limited. But I very slowly got better at it. Finally, published a few stories, continued to write over the years. And then when I retired in 2018, 2018, I kind of realized a lifetime dream and became a full-time writer.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about San Quentin Exodus. I mean, there's a lot of people out there in popular culture that remember Johnny Cash going up there and all the stories and just, seeing the videos and all of that. How did the spark for this book begin and how did it take hold?
Well, in 2013, I found out about a college program inside San Quentin Prison. And so I volunteered and began teaching in it. I mean, I still had a full-time teaching job, but I could teach in the summers or sometimes an evening course. And so eventually, over a period of 14 years, I taught over 20 courses there. And from the very beginning, I really loved it. I felt like it was the most meaningful teaching I'd ever done in my life. Um, and people used to say to me, "Oh boy, you're teaching at San Quentin. I bet you'll write a story about it." And I said, "Not really. I mean, I don't have any ideas for stories." And then when the pandemic started, the prison, of course, was locked down and quarantined. And I just finished a series of short stories about, kind of set in a fictionalized version of my hometown. And so I suddenly got this idea for a story about San Quentin. And I got the idea because from the very beginning, going into the prison, I had often wondered, God, how would someone ever escape from this place? I mean, it's so imposing and impenetrable. These steel barred gates that open for you as you go into the Sally Port, and the 40-foot walls, the guard towers with uh, guards in them with long range rifles and so on. And I just used to think about that. How would someone escape from here? And so the beginning of the novel idea was I thought, okay, what if there was a teacher like me who decided they wanted to help someone escape? And from that, I envisioned one character, the character of the teacher, another character, the character of an inmate. Then I went back and thought about their backstories. And, I was off and running and writing the novel.
So the release date was just a few days ago.
Yes.
So do you do anything special for release days?
Um, Not really. I mean, I sit back and just kind of savor the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, in ways, the kind of celebration, I suppose, will be this Saturday when I'll have a book launch event at a local bookstore. And
Okay.
I think there'll be quite a few people there. And that'll sort of seem like a celebration event, I think.
There's been a couple of versions of escapes from Alcatraz and then even with Shawshank Redemption. How much of the lore of people that have theorized on the possibility of escape came into your research and what you were doing?
Well, the actual escape that they plan was something I just thought up myself from having gone into the prison and thought, how could one do this? And it's a nonviolent plan, and no spoilers for me. So
Yeah.
if
Yeah, we'll
people
keep it at
see
that.
how it works, they
That's
can
okay.
read the book.
Yeah.
But that was sort of how the idea came about. I was also aware of some other good novels that had recently been published set in California prisons. One was Rachel Kushner's novel called The Mars Room, a very compelling piece of fiction. I avoided reading those because I didn't want to be influenced by them. Um, and so really the book sort of does not go to school on other fictional works.
So there's a lot of document like we are full of documenting all kinds of people doing things from athletes to artists to there's always these behind the scenes views of people, but writers tend to be more solitary. There's not a lot on that. If you could be in the room and be a fly on the wall for any writer that's ever lived, who would you love to have watched create their work?
Uh, well, unfortunately, watching a writer work is pretty boring. It's like
Right.
watching ink dry, There they are sitting at their desk and, either writing longhand or typing on a keyboard. Um, But if you could get somehow inside their head,
Yeah.
I guess that would be pretty fascinating. And if I had to pick a name, I suppose it would be Garcia Marquez. 100 Years of Solitude is one of my absolute favorite novels, just dazzling in what it does. And I would sort of love to be in his head as he was thinking that up.
Yeah. I think the reason why that question comes to me is I think about like Steinbeck with Travels with Charlie being in that uh in that RV of his, and it's all loaded up, and he's got his old typer, and even Hemingway, all the cats that would be around him, a fresh glass of orange juice, an empty vodka bottle next to him, that kind of a thing. Um so let me ask you this. What is the energy for you to come up with these stories, to work ardently at being a storyteller? What is that energy for you every day to do that at a high level, take care of your soul, all of that together?
For me, it really is that I love doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes when you talk to writers or read interviews with writers, they'll talk about a love-hate relationship with the process, and they pick up the typewriter and throw it across the room and so on. For me, I just really, really like it. I enjoy doing it. My favorite part of writing is actually revising. Once I've already got some basic thing there and I can sort of work on it, fine tune it. I think of myself at that point like the sculptor who's sort of got the basic shape and now he's just chiseling away to make it exactly the way he wants it. So for me, I just love doing it. And when I finish a piece and haven't started a new one, I feel a little bit at loose ends. Like I really want to get back to writing.
So if you were to have a dream tonight and run into that young version of you from Kentucky, trying to figure out what you want to do, how you want to change the world, and you walk in at your age now, and there's a film projector in the room, and you click play, and there's a 60-second highlight reel of the life you've lived, would that young version of you believe your life turned out this way?
I think so.
Yeah.
My mother was a teacher and I became a teacher. Um, there were makers in my family, as I said earlier, and I became a maker of sorts. Um, I loved dogs as a kid and animals. Unlike Hemingway, I've got a dog around rather than cats, and so yeah, I think I would believe it. I don't think there were any great surprises or any shocking changes in my life direction.
So in that 60-second highlight reel, what are you the proudest of? What are you the happiest about?
I think my teaching, I mean, God knows I've made plenty of mistakes and, there have been people I failed to reach and so on. But in my better moments, I think I've been a good teacher at various levels, not only the guys in prison, but, before that, high school students or college students. I think in many cases, I've done something good for them, help them think clearly, help them learn to write clearly, induced in them a love of literature. So I think it would be the teaching. I mean, the writing is a little strange because, it really is like that old story of putting a note in a bottle, sealing it, and throwing it into the sea. You don't know if anybody will find it. If they find it, you don't know what they'll think of the the reading that they do on the piece of paper. It's really all quite unknown. And though there are moments when you'll hear from a reader, for the most part, you really don't.
Yeah.
So it's it's a strange feeling. Whereas in teaching, they're right in front of you. You read their expressions, you get feedback from them. At the end of the year, they say, "Gee, you've really affected me." So there's a lot of feedback. So the two activities are quite different in that way.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you. Family, friends, fans, students, everyone in different capacities, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Um, I think I'm a person who's loyal. I have things, I have people, I have animals, I have projects like writing or teaching. And in my quiet, modest way, I really stick to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason that I love dogs so much. I mean, I think the one virtue that dogs are the embodiment of is loyalty.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I love dogs. And it's so good when there's an animal in the shot. Your shepherd's back there. I love it. It's wonderful. I had an Australian shepherd for a while, so I have a soft spot in my heart for that breed. They're
Uh,
wonderful. So, as an adventurous sort, as a wanderer, writer, if you could get into a time machine and go back in time and see one event in human history, where are you going to go? What would you love to see unfold before your eyes?
oh boy, that's a tough question. Why don't you ask me something easy, like, my favorite Beatle or something? But boy, there's so much to choose from. I suppose I'd like to see Jesus of Nazareth teach.
Yeah,
In a similar way, I'd like to see Socrates in the marketplace, embarrassing the people who have power.
yeah,
Um, th things like that come to mind.
yeah. All right. So, favorite Beatle album.
Um, as someone who was coming of age during that period, one of the things that was so amazing about the Beatles is that they reached a point where every album, it seemed like they were a totally new group.
Yeah,
Um, but one of the early albums that was somehow different that I remember with a lot of affection is Rubber Soul.
yeah,
And all four were special in various ways. I suppose I kind of like Paul because he was, polite and being a good Southern boy, I'm polite. And so I suppose John, who was maybe the most genius of the group, would be a little edgy for me.
yeah.
So maybe Paul was my favorite Beatle.
I'm glad I could lob an easy one in. So San Quentin Exodus it just came out a few days ago. It's out on Amazon. If anybody wants to look into anything else that you've done, any of the other wonderful work, where's the best place to go for any and all of it?
To my website, it's billsmoot.net.
Okay.
And there they can see, the short stories, the essays, as well as this novel. And then I have a collection of short stories coming out in November.
Okay. Okay.
And those are the stories I alluded to. They're sort of set in a fictionalized version of my hometown in the late 50s and early 60s.
Okay.
So it's really they're kind of period stories.
Yeah, wonderful. Bill, this has been great. Thank you, sir. Thank you for taking a minute out. Best of luck on the book and everything else. It was great to meet you.
Okay, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. You
Yes,
have a
sir.
good show.
Thank you. And